Chief Executive Officer of the Palestine Investment Fund and a Senior Economic Advisor to President Mahmoud Abbas. He spent, I guess, 15 years in the World Bank, has a master's degree and PhD in management economics from George Washington University, and got his bachelor's in engineering at Baghdad University. Mohammed, welcome. The floor is yours. After Mohammed is finished, there'll be a panel discussion. You're welcome to sit there if you want to. And Tony, welcome.
Thank you. My God, what a maze.
And Ingar Anderson, also welcome to you. But thank you very much for all being here. I look forward to a very productive session, and good to have you.
Yeah, let me just reinforce something. First of all, welcome again to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Wilson was our only PhD president, and he believed deeply in breaking down the barriers between the academy and the university on one hand and the world of practitioners on the other. And we're going to need to summon up all of the wisdom of the scholar and all the experience of the practitioner in order to deal with a very interesting and very complicated subject today. Just a note on housekeeping. You're going to speak for 15 minutes, if that's okay.
Sure.
Inga and Tony will respond, and if I can contain myself, I may offer a comment or two.
That I find highly unlikely.
Probably not, but I just want to say, in terms of the Q&A, yeah, I said that Inga and Tony will respond to your presentation. In terms of the Q&A, please turn off your cell phones, and no station identification beyond your name, rank, and serial number when it comes to your questions, because we want to allow for as many of those as we possibly can. So the floor is yours.
Thank you.
The podium or the...
I'll try to do it from here. I think probably more comfortable. But thank you very much for this great opportunity. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me first to thank Woodrow Wilson Center for giving me this opportunity to be with you today. I'm particularly privileged to be speaking at the center that serves as the official memorial of President Woodrow Wilson, a rare kind of statesman who has redefined politics at a critical moment in the history of mankind. President Wilson's pursuit for national and global peace and reconciliation based on the principles of democracy, free trade, and self-determination had inspired a lot of people around the world. As a member of people who are still inspiring to have self-determination, we are very much interested in President Wilson's legacy. I'm a strong believer in the two-state solution, where Israel and Palestine would live as two independent states side by side in peace and security. To realize the goal, substantive negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians are very important. However, I regret to confirm to you what you already know, that the state of affairs of the peace process are hardly inspiring. The peace process has failed to produce a permanent settlement between the Israeli and Palestinians or deliver the promised independent state for Palestinians. The stalemate promoted many people to declare the peace process dead. Despite the challenges, I personally continue to believe, like the rest of Palestinian leadership led by President Abbas, that there is no other solution but the two-state solution. I'm sure you have something to say about that. All alternatives would entail the perpetuation of the status quo with far more negative consequences for Palestinians, for Israelis, and for regional and international peace and security. However, we all have to acknowledge that the two-state solution is becoming more and more difficult to attain with the continuing stalemate in the peace process. and with the expansion Israeli settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The settlements, ladies and gentlemen, create facts on the ground that undermine territorial integrity and economic viability of any future Palestinian state. The Palestinians, under the leadership of President Abbas and Prime Minister Fayyad, have made very important strides in the last few years in building the institutions of the future state. Law and order were restored, professional security forces were built, and government institutions were rebuilt. The World Bank, in a report from last September, affirmed that Palestinian institutions have achieved a level above the threshold for a functioning state in key sectors. In this respect, Palestine has achieved more than many states that are full UN members. On the economic issue, which is the focus of our discussion today, the West Bank has witnessed significant economic growth over the last 5 years. Unemployment went down, foreign direct investment started to flow back, and businesses and entrepreneurs started to invest and expand. However, all this progress is now being seriously endangered. The economic growth over the last few years was fueled by the positive impact of 4 factors: the restoration of law and order, the removal of some restrictions on movement and access by the Israeli authorities, the generous and strong support by donors, including the United States, and the resilience and creativity of the Palestinian businesses and entrepreneurs. These factors, I'm afraid, have largely exhausted themselves. Today, economic growth in the West Bank has largely stalled. The Palestinian government is facing severe fiscal crisis with continuing difficulties in meeting its payroll obligations. The Palestinian private sector is getting closer to a breaking point. We are now entering a dangerous new stage of economic hardship, fiscal crisis, and a vanishing hope. This dangerous turn of events could lead to serious consequences to both Palestinians and Israelis. A prosperous and stable Palestine, which is able to offer its citizens good jobs and an opportunity for prosperity, is in the interest of Israelis as much as it is in the interest of Palestinians. Rising economic standards and growing middle class are the best guarantee to peace and stability in the region and the best insulation against extremism in the region. While this dangerous situation is partly a byproduct of the current moment of political uncertainty and the reduction in donor support, it primarily reflects a fundamental structural distortion in the Palestinian economy caused by the current framework that governs economic relations between Israel and Palestine. Going forward, we need a permanent engine for growth. I believe that sustainable growth can be achieved only through a vibrant growing private sector. Building competent institutions, as important as that is, cannot alone guarantee sustainable economic growth. Such growth is ultimately impossible under the limitations imposed by the occupation. Indeed, creating long-term prosperity requires a radical break with the current framework governing the economic relationships between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and replacing it with a new framework that grants Palestinian and the economic independence and gives them the full control over their economic affairs. The Protocol on Economic Relations between Israel and the PLO, also known as the Paris Protocol, which was signed in 1994, provides for the framework for economic relations between the two sides. This was supposed to be an interim agreement lasting 5 years, but it's now more than 18 years old. It's no more good to govern the current relationships. This arrangement, which was supposed to implement a trade regime called custom union, has set the framework for an unequal marriage. Not only that the framework was deeply flawed, but in reality, subsequent Israeli governments frequently violated its terms. The protocol imposed many restrictions on the Palestinian trade with the outside world, thus cutting the Palestinian territories from natural trading partners in the Arab world and Europe. It also mandated that all goods coming into and out of the Palestinian areas had to go through commercial crossings that were fully controlled and managed by Israel. In practice, Palestinian imports and exports were subjected to excessive and costly restrictions and security clearances, which caused a prohibitive increase in the cost of doing business and in significant delays of clearing goods from ports and airports. On tax issues, the Paris Protocol required the Palestinian Authority to align many of its taxes with that of Israel, with no regard to differences in the structure and level of development in the two economies. It also provides for a revenue clearance mechanism whereby Israel collects certain taxes, including import duties, custom duties, and value-added taxes, VAT, on behalf of the Palestinian Authority, and then transfer them to the Palestinian Authority. These arrangements give Israel a substantial leverage over the PA's fiscal affairs. On many occasions, as a matter of fact, they will help these transfers, which presented the PNA with a major financial stress, and affected the Palestinian economy in a very adverse way. On monetary issues, the protocol denied the Palestinians the right to issue their own currency, effectively denying them the capacity to set and implementing an independent monetary policy that is in line with their economic needs and priorities. One of the key benefits of the Paris Protocol for Palestinians was supposed to be labor mobility between Palestinian areas and Israel. However, in reality, subsequent Israeli government have aggressively limited Palestinian access to the Israeli market. And today, I think the number of Palestinian workers in Israel is about 40 to 50,000 people, compared with about 240,000 in 1999. Finally, under the Oslo Agreement framework, Israel has ultimate control over the Palestinians' use of Palestinian natural resources, including most of the land designated in the agreement as Land Area C, which represents 60% of the land of the West Bank. It also put controls on use of water, Palestinian use of their own water, electromagnetic spectrum, and energy resources. These arrangements on trade, fiscal, monetary policies, and natural resources have failed to deliver economic prosperity and opportunity to the Palestinian people. It caused the Palestinians major structural imbalances, which prevented it from achieving sustainable development and growth. I'll just mention 3 examples of these imbalances. Today, substantial trade dependence on Israel is in place. The trade deficit with Israel today is about $3.2 billion, constituting close to 60% of Palestinian GDP. Second example, substantial budget deficit, an average of $1.3 billion annually, which led to reliance on foreign aid because there's not enough resources to cover the budget needs. And the third example is the unemployment rate, which is now at the level of about 21%. That was at least the statistics in 2011. So there's a serious problem here in terms of trade dependence, in terms of budget deficit, in terms of dependence on foreign aid, but also in terms of unemployment. I think there's a need for a new framework that should provide for a free and independent economy, and I think should take care of these 3 key areas where the Palestinians will have full control on their own trade policy, full control in their own fiscal and monetary policies, but also full control in terms of being able to access their natural resources, whether it's land or water or electromagnetic fields or gas fields to be developed, or areas like the Dead Sea, which potentially would provide a lot of opportunities for mineral extraction and tourism in the area. I think it's becoming evident that incremental improvements within the current framework have exhausted themselves and are no longer sufficient to deliver meaningful growth. Such incremental confidence-building measures, this is a new language being used lately because of the nature of the interventions in the international community on these issues, confidence building measures, or CBMs, typically focused on small day-to-day issues that have little transformational potential. And I think these incremental steps are no more good enough to produce the results and the transformation we all hope for in the Palestinian economy. I therefore argue that what we need is a fundamental overhaul of the current economic framework. Before I move to the last section of my presentation, I would like to make 2 points very clear. First, there's a big difference between economic independence and economic isolation. Although the new Palestinian economy will seek to part ways with the economic legacies of the occupation, it will actively pursue opportunities for mutually beneficial, equal economic relations with Israel. Israel, after all, is a strategic neighboring country with abundant expertise and knowledge in areas that are critical to the future Palestinian economy, including information technology, industry, and agriculture. The second point I would like to make is that Palestinian economic independence is by no means a substitute for political reconciliation and to political independence. Rather, it complements it. I see economic independence as an essential and necessary ingredient in the road to full political independence, in that it differs from the economic peace propagated by some as a substitute for political progress. Now, a few words about what we do at the Palestine Investment Fund. It's our duty that in time of stress, like today, to provide people with a sense of hope and possibility. Standing still is not an option. A successful program for economic development and job creation in Palestine, enabled by the unleashing of Palestinian private sector, has an unparalleled promise. That's what we do at PIF. The Palestine Investment Fund, which I have the honor to serve as its chairman and CEO, has been at the forefront of leading and implementing such a program, despite all the challenges and obstacles that I have described. Over the last few years, and in partnership with local, international, and regional partners, Palestine Investment Fund has launched many successful ventures that created thousands of jobs. I'll provide a few examples. The first 2 affordable housing planned communities to be built in Palestine. The first of them is 2,000-home neighborhood called Al-Rihan, north of Ramallah, and another neighborhood called Al-Jinan, which has 1,000 units in the city of Jenin. A second example is a $500 million mortgage finance facility in partnership with the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank Group and OPEC of the United States and local banks to facilitate access to mortgage finance for the working and middle-class Palestinians, thus increasing home affordability. Another example, $230 million loan guarantee facility in partnership with OPEC and the Middle East Investment Initiative and 9 local banks, which facilitates credit to small and medium enterprises, benefiting so far more than 500 businesses. Another example, the second mobile operator, Wataniya Mobile, which was launched 2 years ago with a total investment of $400 million in partnership with the Qatari QTEL, and which was led to liberalizing the telecommunications sector, improving services, and reducing prices to customers. Another example, a $50 million private equity fund in partnership with Abraj Capital from Dubai, with involvement from the IFC, European Investment Bank, and other local investors. The fund objective is to channel much-needed equity investment to small and medium enterprises. Another example, a $50 million public equity fund with Ras Al Investment Bank of Dubai to invest in the shares of companies traded in the Palestine Stock Exchange. Last but not least, PIF has just launched a new ambitious program called Sharakat, Arabic for partnerships, to channel more than $250 million in investment and financing into small and medium-sized enterprises in new sectors, including agriculture, services, manufacturing, and health services. We could do much more if we were free of the current restrictions imposed by the Paris Protocol and the Israeli practices on the ground. But let me conclude with the following. I believe that with our highly educated and skilled people, Palestine should be able to take its place among the emerging economies. This, however, requires the freeing of our untapped potential from unjustified restrictions, forced dependency, and current political impasse. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to do everything we can to save the two-state solution. Peace is not only about treaties, but also about our ability to positively affect people's lives. We will continue to do our part, and we are optimistic that the world will do its part too. Thank you.
Dr. Mustafa, thank you. We'll now hear from Inge Anderson.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to speak with Dr. Mustafa, who's doing an excellent job under very difficult circumstances. So it's a real pleasure. You've mentioned many of the areas that are key to the constraints, and here at the World Bank, we issue regularly a report to which you referenced, the September version. We do that in the context of the ad hoc liaison committee. Ad hoc is a little bit of an exaggeration because it's been ad hoc for 17 years, but be that as it may, this is a committee that meets several times a year, composed of the donor community, international community, the Palestinians, the Israelis, under the sort of quartet support. And in the report, as you rightly said, in September of last year, we did highlight that the work and the institutional strengthening of the Palestinian Authority and the journey that they have taken has been one that is presenting today a fairly strong, robust institutional framework, as you rightly referenced. And our concern is precisely that with the fiscal crisis as we see it, this is now in danger of being eroded. The concern being that the fiscal crisis is one where the Palestinian economy, as Dr. Mustafa so ably elaborated, is not entirely in line with and on par with other economies in view of mobility and restrictions that are referenced. And so with these kind of things in place, we are seeing a growing budget deficit, and that's a concern. What we're seeing now, a recurrent deficit of about 10%. And clearly with that degree of deficit, that puts a huge stress on the economy. And moreover, when you are not in total control of the revenues, be it from donors, which will come when they come, or be it on the remittances side, which will come when they are released, that makes the economy jolt. But as a consequence, therefore, and with restrictions being eased or not, as the case may be, the private sector has made some important achievements, and you referenced them, but the potential is so much larger. And as a consequence, therefore, the economy is skewed more towards the public sector, more than what we would like to see. And that's giving a sort of false and a skewed economy that does not necessarily reward the way in which we would like to see jobs, growth, and so on expedite. We see public administration, the security sector, health, education, electricity, water, is about 27-30% of the GDP. This is huge if you contrast it to similar size economies and not where we want to be. At the same time, while industrial and agricultural sectors have declined to from 13 to 9% or such. So there's been a decline in what would be where the private sector space would be. So these are issues that are of concern. You've mentioned the restrictions, which we've shown in a number of evidence-based reports. Essentially, when they're eased, growth goes up. When they are clamped down, then growth slows. I mean, there is a direct relation, which should surprise no one. I mean, if you can't move your goods, then obviously growth slows down. And so there are real opportunities, as you rightly said, on the private sector space. And then the question is what to do. And I think on other sectors, we've seen the Palestinian Authority step in and be very bullish in spite of all the constraints on reforms, whether it was on fiscal, whether it was on institutional, a series of reforms where they have been quite bullish and roll these out. And there is a real opportunity now, of course, especially with the Palestinian Investment Fund's work, to poise the private sector and to poise the Palestinian economy to take advantage for something that has to come. Because with the kind of makeup, high skills, sophisticated economy, the neighborhood, there is actually a market niche, we feel, for the private sector and for growth. And so building the trade policy and building the trade infrastructure will be very important to the success that has to be delivered. Now, Israeli restrictions will still matter, so, but I'm addressing now the economic aspects here. And inside there, we would say that there are 3 areas where maybe the Palestinian Authority can actually put their shoulder to the wheel, notwithstanding the areas where the Israelis need to put their shoulder to the wheel, which are very clear. And they deal on 3 issues. One would be on land. Now, we know that Area Cs are not under Palestinian Authority administration, so this is a big political area that needs to be obviously addressed through political processes. But for the land that is under administration by the Palestinian Authority, registering and allowing that land to have a place in the economy, to have firm title systems and such. And the Palestinian Authority is precisely stepping up on this, which is very good, because there is a lot of vacant land suitable for development. Vacant land suitable for development is scarce, and only a small percentage of that land is actually registered and titled. And so that would also help in the housing market, notwithstanding the big issue around restrictions. I keep having to say that nota bene because we can't just put the load on, obviously, the Palestinian side. Then there is the issue around legal reform where, like many countries in this part of the world, have got like layers upon layers of legal legacy, from the Ottomans to the British Mandate to Jordanian, Egyptian, Israeli. It's a morass. As a citizen of Palestine, I don't know how the individual citizen navigates this legal system. And so the most pressing laws are transactions law, company law, competition law, leasing law, tenants law, and laws around lands and housing. So there is an area here which can be tidied up. And many neighboring countries have the same legacy. Not quite the Israeli one, but the various legacies of legal heritage that have caused confusion and needed to be tidied up. So this is an area that would help poise the Palestinian private sector for takeoff. And the final thing is on education and skills. So the supply side, making sure that the skills that graduate out of the Palestinian universities, which are very highly, these are well-ranked comparatively to the sub-region, but it can be even sharper. And helping prepare those students for the skills for the modern workplace. These are 3 areas that, in spite of all the difficulties which you have highlighted and which that are within Palestinian control now, and where I think the Palestinian Authority is working on it, but obviously with the fiscal crisis that's taking, as it would, the attention away from the preparing for statehood efforts in view of the stress on the economy. So whilst one could, and I would not actually classify these as incremental confidence building, they are central to any state, and any state that needs to have success as part in trade and the private sector. It's clear that the private sector is the path to the sustainable growth. That is where the jobs will be in the long run. And the broader political area, which I don't work in because I work in the economic space, is one that clearly will need to get greater attention, because what we are seeing now is not sustainable pertaining to the economics. And when we see the economics falling apart, as we're seeing with the fiscal crisis and the pressures that is put, that will deny the emergence of a middle class, that will deny the emergence of a sustainable economy, and we know that that cannot be good for a political outcome. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Verstandig, so nice to see you.
So nice to see you, Mr. Miller. I must admit, I'm reflecting on the many conversations, and Inga, Aaron, and I don't know if we cringed when you mentioned the AHLC, but reflecting on its 17-year legacy, let me use that as a springboard for some comments. I'm interested in sort of a stock taking of today and a springboard for some new thinking. We, I think in this room, appreciate the political context. And Mohammed, you laid out beautifully, very well, the political context. We recognize the political underpinning of the economic realities of Palestine. But I think it's a very important opportunity to sort of revisit some new thinking. And the AHLC framework, I think, is a very useful and has been a useful framework for decision making. But I would like to suggest that it's an opportunity for some new thinking and to make some adjustments and taking into account what's happening on the ground in a very positive way. So at the Aspen Institute, we've launched a very interesting undertaking among other undertakings, and you have mentioned the Middle East Investment Initiative, of which you are a part, and the Middle East Investment Initiative has been up and running and has been a viable mechanism, lending mechanism for catalyzing, I think, meaningful growth and lending in that small and medium-sized business space. It's real, it's lasting. I also think that as we look at the growth opportunities and the repayment, its proof of concept is very important. I also would like to suggest the word needs to be spread, because it is proven to be very successful. And small and medium-sized businesses are expanding because of this very useful undertaking. So that's point number one. Jobs are being created because these businesses in this space are able to secure the loans to grow their businesses. Secondly, the public-private partnership space that we have launched at the Aspen Institute together with the U.S. government, it's from Morocco to Indonesia and Pakistan, but we have a public-private partnership that has been established in Palestine. And I think it's important because it recognizes that the private sector, as we have been recognizing and talking about here this morning, has a very important role to play. But I would like to suggest that role needs to be more directly at the table. And as Inga, you gave a very interesting set of recommendations of next steps and what can and should be done. I would like to suggest if you take the opportunities of what public-private partnerships can catalyze in terms of on the ground, and you can use them to really listen when they're at the table, when all the stakeholders are convened at the same time. You can hear from them what their needs are, what the one-stop shopping they need to have in order to invest in what we know needs to happen, which is the flagship projects. That's what you need. You now have a richness of equity funds. You referenced 2 funds. I just would like to bring everyone's attention. Mohammed, you were quoted in a really interesting article in the New York Times, and if I may quote you, "What's happening in private equity at this stage has never been like this. It's unprecedented." So at Aspen, again, we helped stand up Sadara Ventures. You yourself, the Palestinian Investment Fund, you did Abraj Capital, you have Rasmala Investment. What that says to me, when you have 4 private equity investment funds, it's saying there's something here. Money is not, capital can go anywhere, but as we all know, there's a highly educated population in Palestine. And Cisco's investment of 3 years ago is a $10 million investment, and John Chambers speaks so eloquently about what was initially meant to be an $8 million corporate social responsibility investment that was flipped to a hardcore business investment. Why? Because he early on quickly saw that investment was yielding business results. So yes, this is a very difficult climate. I am not Pollyannish. Yes, Aaron and I, regrettably, were there at the beginning. We will be there probably for a long time to come to help and continue to remain involved on the political front. Yes, you have to deal with the political chapeau that is absolutely critical to address the economic complementarity that is necessary. But I think as you look at the context in the region, it's shifting dramatically, and there is a recognition you've referenced. The Gulf Arabs are investing in Palestine. They are not investing enough in the Palestinian Authority in the context of donor support. I fully appreciate that. But this investment is a recognition of an investment in the Palestinian people and the skilled and the skills that they bring to the table. So I would like to suggest that if we could have a little bit more of a conversation about the value of public-private partnerships, how you can leverage those resources, especially in a tight budget environment. Now, I take the point, the Gulf Arabs are not experiencing a tight budget environment, but Europe and the U.S. is. So how do we shift and take those realities into account and help drive a new roadmap to try to get a different economic climate that can help address a government, government fiscal policy that can help lift up what I think is enormous private sector opportunity. And Inga, you gave us a really interesting framework that I think will yield some good conversation. So thank you, Aaron. Thank you very much. And you can leave the numbers. I wish you hadn't referenced 17 years. We could just leave that aside.
Marty, thank you, as usual, provocative and stimulating. Before we go to your questions, I just have a thought or two, because I'm fascinated on the issue of sequence. Peace and prosperity, whether it's Israel-Palestine or any other conflict, go hand in hand, and there's clearly too little of either. You can arguably have peace, that is to say, a negotiated agreement between Israelis and Palestinians without prosperity. The question is whether you can have prosperity on a sustainable basis without not only an agreement on paper, but the implementation of that agreement. Now, this is a very interesting point, this notion of sequence, because 17 years ago, when in fact you had a political process, there was an enormous amount of hope that in fact the politics and the economics could in fact work hand in hand. And the paradox, I think, and it's a cruel paradox, is that during the 90s, the political process was vibrant up until a point, and the economics didn't really gel. What's happened now is quite the reverse. The political process is all but moribund, and yet the process of institution building on the ground in the West Bank and to a degree in Gaza has in fact been quite productive. And what's fascinating about your comment, Mustafa, Dr. Mustafa, and yours, is that there's an intimation here that in fact there are opportunities that still are to be pursued even in the absence of the political process. And that's an interesting point, not to be confused with building from the bottom up without trying to create a structure from the top down, because I don't think there's a precedent in modern history for a people, in this case, the Palestinians, creating and building institutions while under occupation and negotiating their way out of an occupation. I do not believe there is a precedent for this particular paradigm. and it's really complex. So before we go to your questions, I just have one question for Dr. Mustafa and then one for Inga and Tony, the same question, actually. For Inga and Tony, is it possible, or is it desirable and feasible to implement Dr. Mustafa's notion of economic independence in sequence? Because I suspect you're arguing that you can revise the Paris protocols and create a new economic structure together with the Israelis and the donor community, even though you might not have a political agreement. Is that desirable? And is it feasible? That's my question to the two of you. And to Dr. Mustafa, I have an internal Palestinian question to ask you. In addition to the occupation, Israeli restrictions, whatever lack of coherence there is to Palestinian decision-making, you are operating in an environment in which you have a divided Palestinian national movement. You actually even have divisions within Fatah itself. How does that constrain the economics of the situation? Who wants to go first?
I'll take a shot at it, Aaron. I think implicit in your question is that the events surrounding the ever-changing region in Middle East will remain static. I think what we're seeing is that the people in the region are taking their destiny in various degrees into their own hands. I think that the 200-pound gorilla in the room really is the demographics. And as you and I, when we started this process in pre-1993, the reality is the demographics are going to affect outcomes in the very near future. And by 2015, the demographics will change the political equation. I believe that you cannot, and what the Palestinian people and what these investors are suggesting is the status quo is just not going to be acceptable. And they're going to take their destiny and are taking their destiny in their own hands, whether it is creating a state within occupation, as within this institutional structure and standing up that structure, or creating an economic process that creates opportunities for the Palestinian people within occupation, and recognizing, as Inga said so repeatedly, recognizing the constraints, whether it's the Paris Protocol, whether it's movement and access. But those restraints, you're starting to see inherent. Those restraints, there are these constant carve-outs. So we know the carve-outs on the agricultural side repeatedly. And I think you're going to start seeing more and more of that because the elasticity, the band is getting stretched, and the tensions. And so you're going to be created, you're going to hit the wall, and I think literally and figuratively. And I think the Palestinian people are taking their destiny and saying, we want to create opportunities, and that's what's happening. So I would like to create opportunities for hope, and hopefully the economic space. Democracy is about, it's not just about voting. I mean, as Secretary Albright, whom we just celebrated a birthday for her, it's not just the privilege of voting. It's the privilege of having your children going to school, of leading, as President Clinton said so often, the quiet normalcy of daily life, of having the opportunity to vote. That's the end game, of being able to feed your children, of having a job. This infrastructure is completely integrated. And what's happening is the Palestinian people are taking part of this and trying to affect outcomes for their own destiny.
It's interesting the way that you asked the question. In the broader context of the Arab Spring, I've often spoken about this political awakening that we've seen beyond. Palestine has been very politically awake for a long time, but a political awakening that we've seen in the Arab world. And we've often said that for the bread, freedom, dignity, opportunity to be fulfilled, the cry of the Arab revolutions, there has to follow an economic awakening. And in a sort of interesting way, this parallels to your question, but in a different way, because of course, in a deeply political context that we all know, what will the economics, where will the boundaries to the systems, where are you going to be against the sort of systems boundaries, and will there be can one see an economic train that can drive growth, jobs, opportunity, bread, dignity, etc., inside that political context? And I think that what report after report from ourselves, based on economic analysis from others that take more political stances, would show that there are constraints to the economy that are such that the economy cannot go beyond them, whether it comes to freedom of movement, goods, money, people, which also restricts ideas, opportunity, etc. And so there are some constraints to the economy. At the same time, creating as many, as I think Tony's saying, opportunities as possible inside the current context is necessary. So in the long run, I don't know, as you correctly said, of another state that in existence with its all the flavors of statehood that has traveled this journey, and therefore we are in uncharted territory and a long way in following Oslo. And so clearly, as everyone would say on all sides, there is a need for re-examining both the economic constraints, but also what is holding it up on the political. On the sequencing, clearly you are talking about, well, can you have prosperity without peace, and is that feasible? You could, if you had a greater degree of restrictions lifted. Is that advisable? That's another conversation. And so I think that that's not I'm not sure that that's the right question to ask. I think the right question to ask is, what is it that will take on the political track to get proactive movement towards resolution? And at the same time, what is it that all parties need to do, the Israelis, the donor community, the GCC, and the Palestinians, to move forward towards the building of a vibrant economy? And there are areas where everyone has a global responsibility. Everyone who's signed off, signed up, supported the Palestinian process and the Palestinian Authority have a responsibility now. And we at the bank remain deeply concerned about the fiscal crisis. We remain deeply concerned about the drop-off in donor resources. $300 million deficit in the budget this year. This is a significant pressure point. Teachers' salaries, health workers, this is serious business. And so in the AHLC, that was my voice in Brussels a month ago or so, and that's our report. And it continues to be absolutely key that donors live up to their promises. Thank you.
Mohammed, do you want to speak for a minute or two on internal Palestinian politics?
Well, I came to speak about economics. I'm more comfortable doing that. But I must say that the domestic politics is also affecting domestic economics. And it disturbs me a lot for that reason, in addition to the political reason. The division that we currently have has major economic implications. Inger talked about the legal reform, for example, and the fact that we have different legislations before the division, but it's continuing today. But one of its manifestations is the absence of the legislator today, which is necessary to approve many pieces of legislation that have been sitting on the table for a long time, waiting for the Palestinian legislator to come back and endorse them and approve them. So, and that's a major issue for us. I mean, legal reform, especially in reference to the private sector, the companies law, the competition law, and many others, is very important agenda. And the division, the disunity is affecting that. There are financial implications, tax collection, and so on, which is affecting the Palestinian treasury significantly. Unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority cannot today collect the taxes from Gaza. and also cannot collect a VAT remittance that's coming out of Gaza, but still spend and invest in Gaza in terms of salaries for public employees. So that's a major burden in the Palestinian treasury. In addition to, from business perspective, obviously the divided markets, if you like, fragmented markets, is not a good thing. We're already a small country with a small market, so to divide it further is not a good thing from also markets perspective. So there are many economic reasons, in addition to the political reasons, to be concerned about the division that we currently have. I mean, the only thing I could say about this is that this is something that we would like to deal with as soon as possible. I think it's very important to solve this problem, this division, as soon as possible. And clearly, this has also some regional dimension to it, and the regional issues are not getting less complex, they're becoming more complex, which is obviously affecting the division in Palestine. But we do hope that this would come to an end pretty soon, and that also international community would support reconciliation and as soon as possible.
Thank you. Okay, why don't we, is there a mic, or maybe we may not, Mona has it. Yeah, so just please identify yourself before you ask your question. Yes,
My name question is, how do you see, thank you. How do you see in the future plan of a Palestinian state, how do you see the economical state in Gaza? And along with economics, how do you see building for democracy through education? Do you put that into consideration as projects and stuff like that for teaching normal citizens and promoting democracy education in the Palestinian lands in order to build a democratic future Palestinian state? Thank you.
do you want to take? Yes, I think that would be appropriate.
Okay. Well, thank you for the question. I'm glad you raised the question about Gaza, which is, in addition, we discussed it in a negative context in a minute earlier. But in a more positive note, I think Gaza economy has a huge potential in terms of land development. One of the good things that happened is that the Israeli settlements were removed from Gaza, and there are about 1/3 of Gaza land is actually free now for housing projects potentially and other things, and tourism projects. This has to be done, and that's again one of the economic disadvantages of the disunity that we currently have. But I think Gaza, in terms of land development, in terms of tourism development, has a huge potential. And two, I think the workforce in Gaza, you mentioned, Inger, something about education and skills. I think especially vocational skills and manufacturing skills and agricultural skills in the sectors that we need to expand in, Gaza have a very professional, very highly skilled labor force, which we can count on. The third example is the gas that we have discovered offshore Gaza, which we still hope to develop in the coming years. This is potentially will bring significant resources to the Palestinian Authority, but also help deal with the energy crisis that Gaza often has because of the lack of fuel and because of the high cost of fuel. So I think there are several areas where would bring economic growth to Gaza. In the manufacturing sector, Gaza was used to be one major place for outsourcing for Israeli companies, especially in the textile sector. Tens of thousands of people used to work on things that are exported in textile through Israel to the rest of the world. And the workforce is still there. I think we need better times. Unfortunately, we need better political environment. We replaced the occupation with less than enlightened political leadership in Gaza. And I hope that things will change pretty soon so that people of Gaza will be able to have a better education, but also better economic development.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Shireen. I'm from Voice of America. How many checkpoints are there in the West Bank now, and why aren't there any factories in the West Bank?
Well, there are factories in the West Bank, and there are fewer checkpoints today in the West Bank than it was before. I think the number of checkpoints today is about 35 or something like that, if I'm not mistaken. So that's why we're kind of moving from talking about these physical restrictions in terms of checkpoints into what I would call more the institutional and policy restrictions coming out of the trade policy, the monetary policy, the fiscal policy. And that's why I try to emphasize on the need to change not only the physical restrictions in terms of checkpoints, but also in terms of institutional restrictions, in addition to the trade infrastructure that Inger also talked about, the need for an airport, for port, for commercial crossing that would enable free trade with neighboring countries. So there are fewer checkpoints. I think one of the reasons, as I mentioned earlier, why we were able to achieve economic improvements and growth over the last few years was the major reductions in the number of checkpoints in the West Bank. But as I also said, these reasons, including the removal of checkpoints, are exhausting themselves. I mean, you can do so much out of removing checkpoints. What you now need is something that will enable you further to do much more than simply live a normal life with less number of checkpoints. In terms of manufacturing, as Inger said, one of the major sad stories is that the size of the manufacturing sector has declined over the last 10 years or so, from about 12-13% of the GDP to about 6% today in the private sector. There's a huge problem with the manufacturing sector. Has to do with competitiveness, and I mentioned as a consequence of the distortions that's happening in the Palestinian economy, the cost of doing business is becoming high, and the cost of therefore the ability to be competitive in the manufacturing sector and be able to compete with the China of this world and Vietnam of this world is very difficult. I mean, believe it or not, Hebron and Gaza used to produce a lot of textile and a lot of shoes and so on. But today, Chinese products are dominant. And the cost of producing them in Hebron is much more expensive than bringing them from China, believe it or not. So we have to become competitive. And the manufacturing sector has to become more competitive and reduce the cost of doing business. And that's why we're talking also about the need to develop a new framework that would make things a bit more efficient in terms of production. But there are manufacturing facilities. There are factories in the West Bank and Gaza. They're not enough, but there are some. And as I mentioned earlier, one of our programs in the Palestine Investment Fund, with the support from the Palestinian Authority, is to try to do more in the industrial sector. That's why we're launching a $60 million investment fund that will focus primarily on investing in small enterprises that are operating in the manufacturing area.
Hala.
It's a question to four of you. Given the constellation of the current Israeli government, and all of you are familiar with the way they operate, the way they think, what do you think is the reaction going to be to your proposal?
I hope that they will jump at this. I hope that they will find this as a good solution to deal with some real issues on the ground, and also give everybody some breathing time to complete their political negotiations. We all know that the political environment today is not great. We don't have hopes, high hopes at least, that anything will happen in the coming few months, unless politicians surprise us and do a great job, and then we'll, of course, we will be very, very happy. But until that happens, I think we have a responsibility to do something to save the situation until the politicians sit together and reach something. The situation, as I think was explained very well by my other colleagues, is very dangerous and very serious. And unfortunately, we cannot afford to continue to pretend that there is nothing happening and that we just have to wait until the politicians come up with a deal. That might take some time. We therefore believe that dealing with the economic issue will lend us some time and give us an opportunity to not only deal with the major economic crisis that we currently have, which is important, because that crisis might lead to consequences that we will regret. And this is real. I'm not exaggerating here. I don't know when things could explode in the West Bank and Gaza. So this is serious. So talking about dealing with the short-term issues is important, but also why waste the time? Even if the politicians are on the right track to produce a political agreement, let's start talking about the economic issues that would hopefully become part of the final political agreement. These issues will take time. To come up with a trade policy and trade infrastructure, ports and airports and developing the land and approving all these legislations and so on. So it takes time. Building a good education system. Yes, we have done quite a bit under very difficult, still under occupation. But there are things that cannot continue, cannot be done under occupation. So I think the Israeli government should jump at this as a good opportunity to keep peace and keep quiet in the region, but also hopefully gain some time, use this to gain some time to prepare people for the political agreement.
Mr. Miller?
Look, I think this Israeli government isn't about peacemaking or war-making. It's about peace and quiet, and not peace in the diplomatic, negotiated sense of the word. The idea that, the Israelis could be induced, I suppose, to lift additional economic restrictions, and may well, I don't know. But the notion that they're prepared to confront right now some of the core issues relating to economic independence, control over water, borders, trade policy, I think defies not only the politics as currently structured, but the way the Israelis negotiate. And it's not, I'm not moralizing or editorializing here, but there is a sense in a negotiation to use the economic leverage that you have as quids for quos. I mean, it's been the way the Israelis have operated. I'm not demonizing them or attacking them. It's in the nature of the way they approach a negotiation. We've seen it countless times. So they will not surrender that kind of leverage right now, it seems to me, but would use it in the context of a negotiation, should one ever emerge, to address all of the issues. So I think there's the prospects of further easing of restrictions, but I doubt whether or not this Israeli government is going to be willing to take risks.
I think that Aaron's correct, except that we need to put sort of, as I referenced earlier, events are changing dramatically on the ground every day. It's just not, and that impacts on the dynamic of both the West Bank and Gaza. We're approaching elections in Egypt. We're looking at the dynamic of what's happening in Syria. To suggest that is not without context of what's happening in the West Bank and Gaza just isn't accurate, because it is all connected. And I think that is a new political reality. Aaron is absolutely correct. The legacy of how Israel negotiates is very much a legacy of interconnecting the economic piece, and I am very keenly aware of that dynamic. That being said, as we see just today in the paper, they have made inroads on the political prisoner issue. So they also, and Aaron's framed it as he always does so well, they do want some calm and some peace. And so it's up to those of us who are involved and invested in the larger context to create opportunities in these coming months to see how we can advance a larger prospect on both a political front, sort of keep our eye beyond we too are in a political transition with our November elections, second term of an Obama administration, or a or
You could mention
I'm having,
I know you're having difficulty.
yes,
You
I'm
could
having
actually
difficulty
mention
here.
the word.
As everyone knows, I have a mixed marriage, or a Romney administration.
There you go.
Yes, yeah, there you go. Thank you, Aaron. This is why we are such close colleagues. Or, and so that is the reality, and that's, you know, so we have to keep our eye on that ball. And, but let's remember, this national unity government is a large coalition government, and this is about leadership. And you can't walk away from political realities and new leadership. So you can't have it both ways. You can't say, I don't have a political support, I don't have the leadership of the Israeli people, and therefore I can't do X, Y, and Z. You now have that. So let's help create a political process to empower those leaders. And I think that those of us who are engaged, both outside of government and those who are stakeholders within an international community of international organizations and government, are mindful of that, and that's how we should be helping to support that process.
Maybe I'd just add that I think any government in the Middle East, including Israel that is placed in the Middle East, is looking at the broad political canvas, as I think any government is in the world. And this broad, very much like Tony's saying, the broad political canvas is shifting ground. Who would have thought a year ago that we would be where we are today in the Arab world, and who knows where we will be 12 months from now on that canvas. So without sort of speculating on what the Israeli government might or might not do, they would clearly keep a close eye, I would expect, as would any actor, on the broader canvas and what is happening, and on relations with countries and how to maintain those. And so I think that the Palestinian context and the Palestinian issues play in very much also to that broader canvas as it evolves.
Yes, on the right, thank you.
Thanks. I'm Leah Odenek from APAC. I'm going to narrow my question down to issues that have been raised here in Washington about the Palestine Investment Fund. And I wonder if Mohammed could answer some of the concerns that have been raised here about the lack of accountability and transparency within the Palestine Investment Fund, accusations of cronyism, that many of the projects are going to the sons of Abu Mazen, and that Fayyad has sort of been shut out of the Palestinian Investment Fund. And of most concern, coming after the statement of President Abbas, that the fund would be used to house the convicted terrorists who were released as part of the Gilad Shalit deal, that would be paid for by the fund. I wonder if you could address those issues.
Sure, we'll be happy to do that. In terms of accountability and transparency, I think Palestine Investment Fund track record has no, probably I would claim with full confidence, has no parallel even at the regional level. We have a board of directors that's very professional, made of independent people, most of them known in Washington, because they come here and work very closely with the government here and the private sector here. But also we have a General Assembly of 30,000 personalities who govern also the whole operations of the fund. In addition to that, the executive management, which is led by myself, I think my track record on these issues speak for itself, and I think we're very comfortable that every penny that's spent in our operation, in our businesses, is the right place and accounted for and reflected very professionally in our books. We retain Ernst & Young. They have been the external auditors for our fund for the last 5 years, the international accounting firm as external auditors. But on top of that, we are also audited by Deloitte & Touche, another international audit firm, to do the internal audit. On top of the external audit, we retain them to also do the internal audit as well. We're also subject to the State Bureau of Financial and Administrative Controls, which is the state controller, if you like, who also review our books. So we're very, very comfortable with our accounts and how we do business. We do business in a very transparent way, and everybody who worked with us, including large private sector institutions, but also large multilateral institutions, including IFC, including European Investment Bank, including OPEC, including Abraj Capital, including Rasmala Investment Fund, including Qatar Telecom. All of them testify to the transparency and the professionalism in which we handle our business. In terms of, to talk about President Abbas, this is cheap domestic politics, I'm afraid to say. I know it's elections year in the U.S. I know the President Abbas policies are not necessarily liked by some people in Washington. That's a fact. But we should, PIF as a professional organization, should not be punished for political maneuvers or political exploitations. So President Abbas or his sons has nothing to do with PIF. They don't benefit from PIF. They don't work with PIF. They have nothing to do with it. It's purely politically motivated stuff. Third point about Prime Minister Fayyad. I have the privilege of being the chairman only after Prime Minister Fayyad became Minister of Finance and Prime Minister. He came from the IMF, I came from the World Bank, the same kind of background, because President Abbas wanted to make sure that there is continuity in this important institution. So when Prime Minister Fayyad decided to run for elections in the fall of 2005, President Abbas asked me to go to go there. I was here in Washington. He invited me to go and replace Prime Minister Fayyad because he then decided to run for elections. And we all know the major achievements that the Palestinian Authority under Prime Minister Fayyad was able to achieve. And transforming PIF started with Fayyad in 2003. I want to assure everybody, including the colleagues at ABAC, that the fund is continuing and expanding its professional work that Prime Minister Fayyad started. Some people try to play the politics of this is president, this is prime minister, this and that, but we don't buy this. There's only one government. There's only one elected president, which is President Abbas. President Abbas chose Prime Minister Fayyad to be the prime minister, sometimes against the recommendations of Hamas or Fatah or this or that, but that's his choice. And he also chose me to be the head of PIF. There's no contradiction here. Now, the separation of authorities here, why Prime Minister Fayyad is not governing the fund, well, simply because he has much bigger and hopefully more important job to do, which is running the government. And I think he's done a terrific job. I hope we can claim the same on the PIF side. In terms of Shalit deal, I don't know what we have to do with that, but yes, there was something in the media that Palestine Investment Fund is going to build homes for prisoners. Why would I do that? We're an investment fund. Our program is very clear. It's on the website. It's in the annual report that you can look at. It's in the audited financial statements that Ernst & Young produce every single year. It's not our business to build houses for prisoners. We build houses, that kind of houses I mentioned in my speech, affordable housing. We have a 30,000 units of housing program that we plan to build. We built so far the first two developments, one and 2,000 units in Ramallah, which is about to be completed. That created 200,000 work days so far. That's a project alone. So we're focused on doing the right things, creating jobs, making life easier for people, and the job of who build homes for prisoners is the last thing we need to worry about.
I think we may have time for a couple more questions. One more question. Is that Jim Plack, I see?
Jim Plack, Cambridge Energy Research. This is a question for Ms. Verstandig. Would you elaborate on your comment about the demographics, the directions in which they're going, the speed with which they're accelerating, and what the implications are for the region's economy?
Well, Jim, I think that what we're all looking at is the demographics of the relationship of the Palestinians and Arab population and the Israeli population, and there's a great deal of concern about if there's not a progress toward an end of the Arab-Israeli conflict and a creation of a viable Palestinian state. As Ehud Barak said several months ago, you will be looking by 2015 of an inverted relationship of the Jewish population in Israel being in the minority and controlling a majority population of Palestinian Arabs. And it is something I don't want to see. I want to see a viable Palestinian state living side by side Israel in peace and security. And I believe as you look at the polls and continue to look at polling data in Israel, the Israeli people want to see the same. So the question on the table is, we all know, we are keenly aware of the framework, and Aaron has spoken and written quite often about the realities of resuming a political process. The question on the table is one of when will the politics and leadership of respective stakeholders permit a opportunity to reconvene back at the table in very short order to tackle the key issues. And it's not that it's going to be easy. That's not what the question is. But there's a lot of work that has been done and can be recalibrated in a way that I think if there is a leadership and a sense of commitment, that those issues can be addressed in a meaningful way. And I believe very strongly, and I have a great sense of urgency, and I'm hopeful that after our election process, that when things calm down, we will be able to reconvene and get back to the table, and the stakeholders will be able to pick up on this very important process. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and thank our panelists.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you.